The Soviet Union, one of the greatest powers on Earth, and possibly in all of history, and its little brother, Yugoslavia, which was known for its diversity, both vanished in the early 1990s. But that didn't have to happen. The question of this alternate history timeline is, what if they survive? Africa was underutilized as a front during the Cold War. I think in the 90s the USSR would see it as a place for rich expansion of communism and redouble their efforts there. Perhaps South Africa sees a communist uprising instead of a peaceful end of apartheid. If so, that could be the next Vietnam. If this uprising is crushed, who knows how long apartheid would last in this world. The only reason why it lasted as long as it did in our timeline is because it was used as an excuse to hold back communism in South Africa. 9/11 would attack the Soviets instead of the Americans. Bin Laden wanted to get rid of the communists before he attacked America. As a backlash to communists still being around, Americans would see Christianity as more of a part of their identity. At least Christians are people of the book, meanwhile atheists would just be slaughtered according to Sharia law. Without 9/11 attacking America, the USA would still support Islamic terror groups against the Soviets. With a stronger Russia, China would be less friendly with them and possibly less aggressive towards other Asian countries having to compete with another superpower. China would probably be a third power in a three-way Cold War and attempting to create its own geopolitical bloc to rival NATO and the Warsaw Pact. America and the Soviet Union could find a new common enemy, China. There might be proxy wars against the Chinese arising, and I can definitely see the Soviets and the US support countries like Vietnam or India in this timeline. American politics would be more Republican, since the Republicans have usually had a much more aggressive foreign policy than the Democrats. Not to mention, with Soviet-style totalitarian socialism still existing, democratic socialist politicians would have much less support in the West. Another serious battleground for proxy wars would be Latin America. Cuba would still be run by the Castros. Venezuela would turn socialist under Hugo Chavez. Depending on how much historical divergence takes place, I could see many other impoverished countries in the region also falling to communism and being a potential battleground for communism and capitalism. The Persian Gulf War wouldn't happen because it's possible that both sides would include their respective client state in a regional alliance, tripwire regional alliances to be exact. Iraq is quite close to the USSR, and it would give the Russians a firm foothold in the Middle East, just like Saudi Arabia would be of prime importance to the United States, which would discourage both parties to engage in a war which they would need to push to the end, because neither side would allow such important allies to be overrun. Since if Saudi Arabia starts winning, Iraq could get overrun and vice versa. Without the Persian Gulf War, Saddam Hussein would have control over Kuwait. So with Kuwait's oil money, he would attack Iran again, this time most likely winning, as he would have more money, which means he would have more weaponry. And he would conquer Khuzestan from Iran, and Iran would lose most of its oil money and become more radical. Possibly become more secular, since their Shia regime would have lost to a secular regime. Or maybe it would become even more Islamic. It might even become a Shia ISIS, since it had to deal with Britain stealing its oil in the past, and now it has to deal with Iraq stealing its oil. Iraq would not have become more radical. On the contrary, it would have remained secular. Saddam turned to religion after 1991 as a way to keep his control. Without the Gulf War, he would have to keep fighting radicals who would want to bring him down. Al-Qaeda would not have been formed despite the Taliban receiving even more US aid, since there would have been no US troops in Saudi Arabia, so no infidel troops on quote-unquote holy soil. If a version of Al-Qaeda does get formed somehow in this alternate timeline, it would focus on taking down secular tyrants like Saddam Hussein, Assad, and whoever would be in control of the Soviet Union. So this means no Syrian civil war, no ISIS, no mass destruction of Nineveh, etc. But the Kurds would be the big losers as they would not be able to gain Kurdistan. They would probably have paid for this with their lives, sadly, without the revolutionary fervor that spread across the Soviet Union as communism fell. Yugoslavia could have been preserved under its own offshoot of communism, Titoism. This may not be the most likely result, but if you read the title of this video, you know this is what I'm going to do. First, let's define Titoism. 1. Economic workers' self-management in most firms. 2. Foreign policy, not aligned officially with either NATO nor the Warsaw Pact. However, occasionally, Tito used to align himself with members of these alliances. For example, the Balkan Pact of 1953 to 58. It was a mutual defense alliance between Yugoslavia, Greece, and Turkey. 3. Identity, brotherhood, and unity. In practice, this means walking a fine line between acknowledging and celebrating the many Yugoslav people's separate identities while keeping them under the umbrella identity of Yugoslavia. 4. Internal politics. One-man cult of personality and one-party rule in a system that did grant a large degree of freedom to most people, but also was politically repressive. For example, in Tito's Yugoslavia, people used to be sent to prison camps like Goli Otok for crimes like making a dirty joke about Tito's wife. If we mean these 4 conditions were essential to Titoism, then we know that Yugoslavia would not be a member of the EU if it exists, since the economic policy and internal politics are incompatible with EU accession, or of NATO, since foreign policy is incompatible. Next, I identify major stressors on Yugoslavia during the 1980s and 90s. A declassified 1984 CIA assessment exposed that Yugoslavia was reliant on the IMF and Western loans throughout the 80s. As a vent for unemployment, Yugoslavia will encourage its excess workers to serve as guest workers in Germany and Austria, just as it did in our timeline. These guest workers both reduced unemployment in Yugoslavia and provided Yugoslavs with a source of hard currency in the form of remittances. But any country that relies on the outflow of migrant workers to sustain its economy is frankly in a bad shape. When it comes to identity, Yugoslavia will achieve mixed success. In Bosnia, ethnically mixed marriages were very common in major cities. A class of elite developed that saw itself as Yugoslav, not having any other ethnic identity, but this class remained small. Tito ruled in constant wariness of the possibility of the return of regional/national protests or uprisings, such as the 1971 Croatian Spring. All this means that the IMF would attempt to force Yugoslavia to dismantle much of the worker-managed structures and implement austerity measures in order to get new loans. The Yugoslav leaders would refuse, since they have no other sources of credit, and Yugoslavia would default on its international loans, plunging into crisis, similar to the one Greece had. I made a video on it, please check it out. Anyway, back to Yugoslavia. Shortages of imported goods such as fuel, severely lowering living standards, more and more Yugoslavians going to work as guest workers, remittances and foreign aid would make up nearly 20% of Yugoslavia's economy. The economic catastrophe put serious strain on the legitimacy of the Titoist government, causing frequent protests. The country would go through a period of deindustrialization as people move out of cities and go into villages again in order to provide food for themselves and their families. The return of many to subsistence farming seriously decreases Yugoslavia's GDP. Since Yugoslavia would stay out of NATO because of the non-alignment movement, Yugoslavia would maintain ties with Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and Venezuela. Yugoslav cooperation with the quote-unquote axis of evil countries would help its economy and military, but cause serious harm to its relationship with the United States and the EU, if the EU exists in this timeline, especially because cooperation here includes illegal weapon sales and sanction violations. Not to mention, Yugoslavia would be a big thorn in the EU's side for a while, a part of Europe that refused to join the rest of it. While there wouldn't be ethnic cleansing, there would be a totalitarian state within its borders, with a sizable population and refusing any idea of annexation. Big thing would be after the crisis I mentioned. The EU may not want to annex a poor European country country while dealing with Greece's debt crisis. Spain would also likely veto any attempt to invite Yugoslavia to join the EU. You may have noticed that I didn't mention Libya in my axis of evil. That is because we would see a joint NATO, Soviet, and Yugoslav invasion of Libya instead of just a NATO invasion. Since Gaddafi would still want to unite Africa under Islam, which would have been a threat to Yugoslavia's neutral alliance, as well as communist regimes in Africa. When it comes to identity, Yugoslav authorities would start a slow clampdown on all national symbols, especially Albanian, Croat, Serb, and Slovene symbols. This clampdown would result in frequent riots, protests, and standoffs with the police. The West would protest against the heavy-handed tactics Yugoslavia uses. Expatriate nationalists, primarily Serb and Croat, continue to finance terror campaigns against each other and against the Yugoslav state. The huge increase in guest workers means these groups have access to more funds than ever before. Corruption and poverty in the Yugoslav National Army means these terror groups can buy arms within the country for relatively cheap prices. Mujahideen attempt to make contact with Albanians and Bosnian Muslims would find little success. If this picture seems a bit bleak, well, that's because it is. Tito was a brilliant leader and saw how to guide Yugoslavia through his lifetime. He utterly failed to prepare the country for his death and its aftermath. His policies were brilliantly adapted for the time period he lived in. To attempt to copy them wholesale in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s would probably be disastrous. Then again, Tito, much like Ceausescu, took out the IMF loans that Yugoslavia would not be able to pay. You could say he was just lucky to die before the result hit Yugoslavia, unlike Ceausescu in Romania, and he would have been forced to either move towards austerity or default anyway. So maybe I shouldn't have called all these economic policies brilliant.